We're back with another edition of In the News, our segment looking at classic wrestling newspaper articles, and I am joined by the Edward R. Murrow of Wrestling News, none other than Mr. Jim Cornette.
This is London, except it's not actually London, and we're not actually on the radio, and I'm not actually Edward R. Murrow, but besides that,
it's just like
we're ready to go.
Well, Jim, this first article right here is from 1961 in Tampa, Florida. Last time we did this on the show, we had an article from 1961 in Tampa about Don Curtis fighting with a patron at a restaurant. This is from the same town and the same time period.
Judge charges wrestlers tussled to win customers. City Judge Walter Burnside Jr. yesterday accused Saul Weingeroff, parentheses, gentleman, and Eddie Graham of staging a street fight outside Tibbet's restaurant in a, quote, planned scheme to get customers to the wrestling matches, unquote. Burnside, who seemed amused by the testimony, didn't even charge the two for the publicity they derived. He fined each $25, then suspended the sentence. Graham, one of the good guys of the wrestling circuit, denied staging a fake fight. He said they have full house crowds for matches now and that he will probably be suspended for the fracas. Weingeroff is manager of two wrestling villains, Carl and Kurt von Brauner. He didn't deny any publicity intent. Sports writers said Weingeroff's wrestlers are good drawing cards because fans dislike Weingeroff. One such fan spoke out at the trial. Mrs. W.L. Harris of 507 West Paris Street said Weingeroff gets on TV and calls Southerners trash. Weingeroff said Southerners wouldn't even have been allowed to eat in dime stores in Germany, and that American women never comb their hair, Mrs. Harris contended. Furthermore, no man in town is more of an idol with children than Graham. She said Graham does anything to help kids. Graham produced a surprise witness to the fight, Doris Epperson of 308 West North Street. She said she was only 5 steps away when Weingeroff crossed the street to taunt Graham. She said Weingeroff told Graham to get off the street, you dirty bum, and that Graham went around the corner to avoid Weingeroff. But Weingeroff followed and repeated the remark, she said. Graham said he lost his temper then. A policeman said he arrived to find Graham on top of Weingeroff, who was bleeding. Graham said he was on his way to Harry Smith's gym to work out when he saw Weingeroff and tried to avoid the manager. Weingeroff insisted he wasn't that brave and said he brought his wrestlers to court to protect me. Graham said he had never been before a judge before and that the fight embarrassed him tremendously because he was to make a speech at his son's school that same night. Burnside's comment was that he thought Weingeroff got what you had coming to you.
Well, it's an interesting story there. I like the witnesses, the one who has a problem with Saul Weingeroff saying that American women don't comb their hair. But I was always surprised there weren't more instances of staged fights in the street to get publicity. I remember being at Smoky Mountain Wrestling thinking, why doesn't, Tom Pritchard beat up Ricky Morton in the West Town Mall? But, what other instances can you think of fights getting into the newspapers that were potentially staged to draw up interest in an upcoming show?
Almost all of them. That actually, and once again, it used to be an old trick down south to do something like that. And then it was done, quite more often than you would suspect. And sometimes it didn't work and it didn't get any publicity. And sometimes like this article has pretty much been lost to time since it's 56 years ago and we're just now talking about it. But we did do something. We made an angle out of a real life incident in Barberville, Kentucky one time when I had a little set tea with a guy and spoke to our sponsor there in Barberville and was brought to court and made the judge sentence me to apologize to him at the wrestling matches at Knox Central High School next Saturday night. But that was Ronnie West used to have an old trick where when he was as a referee in Chattanooga, because he lived in Cleveland, Tennessee, which is right down the road from Chattanooga. If the heel would beat him up, he'd get real good color and get stitches or whatever, and then he'd go around to bars, and I don't even think Ronnie drank at that point especially, but he'd go in a bar and wait for somebody to ask him, what the hell happened to you with a big scar on his head, and he'd say, no good, dirty J.C. Dykes hit me over the head with his cane last Saturday night at the Memorial Auditorium, and when I was refereeing the wrestling match, and they do things like that, but there have been many staged episodes down through history. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot more of them made the papers and we just haven't found them.
I do love the visual of Eddie Graham in court with this old lady there to talk about what a wonderful man he is. And in comes Saul Weingeroff with the Von Brauners. They came with him.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, of course, in case there was a picture to go along with it. But the thing is, now Obviously, over the last 20 years, you can't do that because they'd know what you were doing. But at that time, besides the fact that people may have known or suspected, as obvious by the tone of the article, that wrestling was a work, nobody could prove it. It wasn't written down anywhere. You really couldn't say for sure. There was no internet and people weren't talking. And, so now if you did it, they would, they wouldn't give you the publicity. They'd just cost, a ton of money for, creating a public disturbance. Either if you didn't get tased or shot or whatever, or a shot at the mall, either by the cops or by some of the patrons.
I love the way it's laid out, too. Saul Weingeroff crossed the street to taunt Eddie Graham, followed him into an alley, and the next thing people know, Eddie Graham's on top of Weingeroff, who's bleeding.
Yeah, it was a hell of a fight, I'm sure, that, that around the corner from where people could see it. But we did one thing with the Gangsters and the Rock and Roll in a bar in Knoxville, but it was closed. It was closed to the public at the time.
One other thing about this is he's come up recently on the show from when he was a booker for Phil Golden's All South Wrestling, but in many ways, Saul Weingeroff's a forgotten guy because he was on the outs with the recognized NWA promotion, Gulas Welch, for so many years. But just how big was Saul Weingeroff and the Von Brauners in Alabama, in Tennessee, in the 60s and early 70s?
Well, not only that, but Florida, as this, they were together for probably the better part of 15 years, the Von Brauners and Saul. And you had a Jewish manager and a, Nazi team. So 15 years after the end of World War II. So that got some heat, but they were a main event tag team and manager combination wherever they went. They lasted twice as long as me and the Midnight Express, and they main evented everywhere, and they drew money. Whether it be Florida or Georgia or Alabama, the entire Tennessee territory. I think they went out west. They had a run in Texas at one time, I think, and they drew huge money. They were hot. As a matter of fact, Bobby Eaton said when he was a kid, the heels that really scared him were the Von Brauners.
Do you know what the falling out was? Why Saul Weingeroff got on the outs with Gulas and Welch?
Well, as the way Jerry Jarrett tells it in my book, Tuesday Night at the Gardens, History of Pro Wrestling in Louisville, when Jarrett took the book, Saul had been in with Nick for years, even before he got together with the Von Brauners, and Saul was from Nashville, and he worked in the sheriff's department there for years. But anyway, Saul was involved in the office and booking at various points for Nick, but when Jarrett made the Memphis end, and built that up, he was only in his 20s. And Jerry told me that Saul, when one time Jerry booked him in Lexington, Kentucky on a Thursday night, and he was not booked in Bowling Green, which was Nick's town, which was only 60 miles from Nashville as opposed to 210 miles. And at the time, Lexington was just opened up, wasn't drawing that well. And so Saul went into Nick's office and said, "Hey, don't let that boy be booking me in his town up there. I want to go to Bowling Green where I can make some money." And Jared heard about it. So later on, when Lexington started doing real big business and it was a bigger building so it could hold more people and was doing better than Bowling Green, Saul went up to him to find out why he wasn't booked in Lexington. And Jared informed him that he heard that he didn't want to be booked in Lexington, and he never, ever intended to violate Saul's wishes. And he said that I'm sure there were other underlying reasons, but Jared said that was the cause of it, and that's why it ended up within a few months. Saul had gotten involved financially with Phil Golden's group and brought the Von Brauners with him on a guarantee, and they were running opposite of Jarrett to very little success.
And of course, later, Saul's son George Weingeroff would be working for the Paphos ICW promotion in opposition to Jarrett. And we'll talk about that in the coming weeks here on the program. But Jim, it is now time to go to a place I know very well, Honolulu, Hawaii, June 4th, 1968.
Honolulu, Hawaii, Associated Press. A 17-year-old Honolulu youth ran away from home recently and went to a local TV station to watch some wrestling in a studio ring. His mother, who was watching the program in her home, spotted her son in the front row. She called the police, who rushed to the station, got the runaway lad, and took him home.
Well, there's one of the problems with live wrestling. Something like that could happen.
Well, we've said before, if you're going to run away from home, don't go on live television. That's things like that, once again, used to happen, especially when, there were 3 TV stations maybe in a market and everybody was watching wrestling. You would pop up rather quickly. I mean, one time at the Louisville Gardens, this was not televised, but somebody escaped from jail, which is like 2 blocks from the Gardens. The Gardens is almost right next to Liberty Street where the old jail was, which is kind of funny. But they got a tip that the guy who broke out of the jail, and I mean, it's not like this was a daring prison break from, Attica or Alcatraz or something. It's a city jail. But they got a tip that the guy was a wrestling fan or going to go to the wrestling matches, and they paged him at the Gardens. Come to the front, please. There's a phone call or whatever. And he came and they arrested him and took him back.
Well, are there any, that's funny. Are there any instances that you know of anything like this happening on Memphis TV, which of course was live every Saturday morning? We know Billy Joe Travis was arrested for child support payments, which he hadn't been making because the police knew he was going to be there, and it happened on TV. But are there any cases that you could think of? Did anything ever happen with anyone in the audience?
In the audience, that may be a new one. We've talked about, the cops getting called when Eddie Gilbert ran Jerry Lawler over with the car in the parking lot, and the cops came and made Lawler go out and show everybody he was alive so they could go on with their day. But I don't know that there's ever been an incident with somebody in the audience like that.
So this may be the only case of a mother finding her runaway son at a live wrestling studio taping.
There probably has been many cases of mothers being impregnated with future runaway sons at a wrestling taping, but
well,
probably not finding them.
For our next story, let's go to a place you know very well, Greensboro, North Carolina, May 7th, 1942.
Chairman Holt's wrestling show, promoter Jim Crockett's weekly wrestling show at Nice Hall, was abruptly called off last night when Abe Urist failed to show up for his opening bout with Morris Shapiro. Dr. C.T. Whittington, chairman of the Greensboro Boxing and Wrestling Commission, refused to let the exhibition go on since the full card could not be presented as advertised. A large crowd had their admission prices refunded. The Black Panther was to have met Sailor Bartow Hill in the main event, and Cowboy Luttrell was to have faced Stanley Pinto in the semifinal.
Obviously, this is very early on in Jim Crockett's Sr.'s promoting career, 1942, but here we have just a athletic commission shutting a show down because the opening match isn't going to take place. Have you ever heard of anything like this?
Not specifically this incident, but athletic commissions all across the country, the chairmanship and people involved in them have always usually been political appointments. Whoever the governor is or, whatever the case, oh, my friend so-and-so, he watches boxing and wrestling on TV all the time. Let's let him do that. I mean, even as late as the 70s and early 80s, we had a commissioner here in Louisville that was chairman of the athletic commission. It was a political appointment. He had never been, he didn't know anything about the inner workings of wrestling, or I don't even know if he'd ever been to a match live. But he decreed that there could be no battle royals because since the rules were stated that if a man was thrown over the top rope, it was a disqualification and the match was over. That meant if you had a 20-man battle royal, you'd have 19 winners. He actually suspended legitimately Jonathan Boyd for hitting the referee, Thomas Marlin, in an angle one night. And Jerry Jarrett had to pay like a $250 fine to get Boyd reinstated so they could come back for the rematch the following week and Boyd could lose the loser leave town match. Lawler and Dory Funk were having a double juice pull apart to one of the most violent things I've ever seen in person, with 15 guys trying to pull them apart. And his name was Fred Lamson. Commissioner Lamson gets on the microphone and says, "Okay, boys, the match is over. Break it up." And Lawler looked at him and said, "If you think it's over, you get your ass in here and try to break it up." There have always been mark commission people that took the rules of boxing and applied them to wrestling, or took the rules of wrestling seriously and suspended or fined people or did things like that. Well, this was false advertising. You can't present the complete show, so you can't have it. They almost stopped the Great American Bash 86 in Philly at Veterans Stadium because Wahoo McDaniel, they had so much blood, and the commission kind of would try to turn their eyes to the blood because even then I think they had a no blood rule, but Wahoo McDaniel got the blade broke off and stuck in his fucking head. They said, "We're going to stop this if there's any more blood," or whatever. So it just, this was a severe case, but at the same time, especially in 1940, they weren't smart. They didn't know what the fuck was going on.
The match you're talking about, the Wahoo match at Great American Bash, was July 1st, 86, and I believe the commissioner was J.J. Binns.
J.J. Binns, that's right. He looked like a human skull. He had the silver hair and this piercing eyes, and he looked like a human skull.
It's important to note that Wahoo had the blade stuck in his head because there were rumors that the WWF had him threaten to shut down the show because he had appeared on WWF TV at the Philadelphia Spectrum a couple days before that, ordering the Junkyard Dog to face Don Morocco in a dog collar match on the next show. So there were a lot of people who had a little conspiracy theory there.
No, Wahoo. He went in the bathroom and was looking in the mirror and squeezed his head and bing, and the fucking blade popped out and hit the mirror like a goddamn pinball.
That must have been a hell of a sight. So let's now go from Greensboro, North Carolina to Amarillo, Texas, January 17th, 1957.
Funk had to pay. Dory Funk has been fined a total of $70.50 for his part in the brawl, which broke up Thursday night's sports arena wrestling feature, including a penalty of $50 assessed by Sammy George, district supervisor of wrestling for the state commission, and a fine of $1 plus costs paid in justice court yesterday on a charge of creating a disturbance. His opponent, Ray Gunkel, pleaded not guilty to the same charge in justice court, however, and was released under $200 bond for a hearing on February 6. Gunkel was not fined by the state supervisor. He said he intends to fight the county case on the ground that Funk precipitated the fight, which ended their match.
How about that? How about getting fined for an after-match fight?
Well, there you and once again, now this is good publicity because people would read that and say, well, wow, that shit got out of hand. I got to see what happens next week.
Yeah.
You know, and once again, it was a violent scene. It convinced the district supervisor of wrestling for the state commission, and everybody, I'm sure, prospered. I'm sure Dory Funk Sr. probably made more than that $70 back at the gate next week after that article appeared.
Let's now go to Albany, Missouri. This is June 13th, 1959.
Lady wrestler gets court fine for fishing. Albany. Lorraine Ann Johnson, 29-year-old blonde lady wrestler from St. Joseph, was fined $5 and $11 costs in Judge Milton J. Hull's magistrate court in the Gentry County seat Monday afternoon. She pleaded guilty to fishing without a permit at Limp Lake near King City on Monday. And I've said it a million times, don't go fishing without a permit at Limp Lake.
Well, this is certainly a first here. Lorraine Johnson is the mother of Baby Doll, correct?
Correct. And she was married after this, apparently, Nick Roberts, who wrestled and then later on was the promoter out in Lubbock, Texas for years and years. But apparently Baby Doll, that criminal, I've told everybody in the 80s Baby Doll was a criminal and she hung out with criminals like the James Boys. Apparently it's because she's descended from a criminal.
Let's now go to Memphis, Tennessee for a rather famous article. This is from January 14th, 1960.
Wrestler Monroe fined. He was in Negro Cafe. Rock M. Bombrow, of course his name was Brombow, but they spelled it wrong, of 1415 Spartan Drive gave the Heels address. Known in the wrestling world as Sputnik Monroe, and another wrestler, Clinton M. Hickman, 27, of 1998 Philsar, were charged with disorderly conduct following their arrest at 12:45 yesterday morning in a Negro Cafe at Beale and Hernando, where they were drinking beer. Monroe was represented in court by Russell B. Sugarman Jr., Negro attorney who ran for the city commission last August. After court, City Judge Boucher said it was the first time he can recall that a white man was represented in city court by a Negro attorney. Hickman, who referees part-time in addition to wrestling, forfeited $26. Monroe did not speak in his behalf, but Sugarman argued at length that Monroe had a right to be where he was, that he is a professional wrestler and has a lot of Negro fans, and he was simply creating goodwill by visiting Negro cafes and having a glass of beer where he could be seen and talk with the people. Arresting officers said Monroe and Hickman were not seated at a table, but were standing at the counter with Negroes around them drinking beer. Officers said the wrestlers gave them no difficulty. Sugarman asked what the disorderly conduct charge was based on. The officer said it was simply on the fact that he was drinking in a Negro cafe with Negroes. Sugarman argued that under the Supreme Court's rulings, a white man has the right to enter a Negro cafe anytime he wishes. Judge Boucher fined Monroe $26 and made no comment. The fine was paid and no appeal was taken.
This, of course, is a legendary story in the middle of what would be a legendary series of events around Sputnik Monroe in Memphis. Let's talk about this, but as we do that, Jim, as a wrestling fan, when did you first hear about Sputnik Monroe?
This obviously was the late 50s, 1959 and 60, when Sputnik got over and was huge and set the all-time record in Memphis with Billy Wixon, etc. I started hearing, when I started watching wrestling around 72, I believe it was the time that Sputnik and Norvell Austin Sputnik had come back to Tennessee. They teamed him up with Norvell Austin, whereas Sputnik had a white streak bleached in the front of his hair. And as a matter of fact, the story is that if you go back in a lot of the late 50s, early 60s high school yearbooks, a lot of the guys, the teenage kids at that time would have white streaks bleached in their hair too, including some of Sam Phillips's kids, who were big fans of Sputnik's. But when he came back in 72, they teamed him up with Norvell, who was a black guy from Memphis, and Norvell bleached the white streak in his top of his hair too. And Sputnik was basically telling people that Norvell was his son, which just created horrible heat, and which he loved. And I saw them a few times then on TV, and also, Lance Russell, to the last television wrestling show he ever did, would think back on and drop Sputnik's name if something reminded him of the great Sputnik Monroe. So he was always mentioned on Memphis TV, even if it had been years since he'd been there. And then later on, when he came back in, and I think it was 79 or 80 as a manager, I got to meet him. He was managing the Manchurians, who were in a previous incarnation were the other Samoans, not Afa and Sika. And, he still had the gravelly voice, and he still did the promo of the Diamond Ring and Cadillac Man. And you'd walk up to him, "Hello, Sputnik," and put your hand out, and "How you doing?" He'd shake your hand. "Sputnik Monroe, world's greatest wrestler. Your pleasure to make my acquaintance." Shit like that. And he was Sputnik. They obviously did this on purpose because he knew, especially being recognized as a celebrity around town and being on TV, that if he went into a bar on Beale Street, that he was going to get arrested, because that's what happened. As a matter of fact, I don't know I think it was a different charge. There was an old Southern charge which equates to vagrancy, but it was called mopery. Moping around. Well, mopery was a charge when they would find somebody just walking around on the street that looked like they were up to no good, weren't supposed to be there, probably going to get in trouble. They'd pick them up and take them to jail and charge them with mopery. And he got arrested a number of times because he would get all dolled up in his suit and a hat with a feather in it and have the handkerchief and, his walking cane or whatever. And he would walk down Beale Street. And in those days, Beale Street was not a tourist attraction. Beale Street was the heart of the ghetto, the black neighborhood. And he knew just by walking down there, he was going to attract attention. And he'd have all kinds of little black kids following him around and making over him and everything, because they loved him. And it drove the white people in town crazy, especially the authorities. And so they'd pick him up on mopery, or they'd arrest him on disorderly conduct, because it was a crime at that point in Memphis for white people to go into black business and associate with black people. And he had a great quote that was reprinted, and where I saw it was, "It came from Memphis," this book on all the culture, whether it be rock and roll or the soul or whatever, all the culture that came from Memphis. He said to the people at the time, he said, "The white people may not like me, and I may be a heel to them, or I may be a bad guy to them, but who's raising their kids? The black maids and the people that come in the back door of all these rich houses around town, the ones that are raising your kids, they love me, and the kids will too."
That's actually a great book by Robert Gordon I read years ago.
Yes, right. But God, you came up with the author's name right off the top of your head. That's insane.
Well, it's a good book, but this is a famous story because not only does he get arrested, but he also hires an African-American attorney, which is just scandalous at that time. But let's talk a little bit about the Billy Wicks feud and, of course, what happens at the Ellis Auditorium and what actually happened and what are some of the rumors about what was really going on behind the scenes with the decision to allow African-Americans to not just sit in the crow's nest.
Well, the story goes, as they tell it, as they say back in those days, Memphis wrestling was down. It was a really bad period. There hadn't probably been 4,000 people at a wrestling match in Memphis since the early 50s, when they'd get a few stars off of network TV to come in. And the promoter at the time was Les Wolf or Ed Wolf, not the job guy from the AWA in the 70s. That was Buddy Wolf. But anyway, until 1957, Memphis was a separate city, a separate circuit, separate talent from Nick Gulas and Roy Welch's Nashville booking office. They ran Nashville and Chattanooga and Birmingham. But in 1957, Nick and Roy bought the town from Wolf. And I'm sure there was probably a little strong-arm coercion, or maybe they just, he was anxious to get out of it or whatever. But that's when they brought in Mickey Barnes from Kingsport to be the local promoter. And then I think they brought in Roy's son, Buddy Fuller, to be the original booker. And about that time, they were able to get television on WHBQ Channel 13. And there hadn't been TV wrestling in Memphis since, I think, like 1951 or 52. They'd go down to the auditorium and air a match or two on Monday nights on WMC, and that most people have forgotten that. So they got TV. Nick and Roy take over the town, but wrestling is on its ass in Memphis. And they were trying to figure out anything they could do. And, of course, that's when they found that kid who'd been broadcasting a few matches up at a local station in Jackson, Tennessee, named Lance Russell. And he came into the picture and eventually ended up being the program director at Channel 13, WHBQ. So they had all these pieces in place, but they needed the talent in the ring. And when Sputnik came in and started cutting the promos and started doing his thing and the big bumps and the wild promos and braggadocious, well, along with a new thing like television wrestling and this great announcer, Lance Russell, and this, transplanted hometown boy, even though he wasn't born in Memphis, he lived there at the time, Billy Wicks, the all-American, shooter, amateur wrestler. They had all the pieces in place, and they started noticing that Sputnik was getting over with the black folks, but the white folks were still kind of dribbling and drabbing. And in those days, blacks were only allowed to sit in the balcony, the crow's nest at the Ellis Auditorium. So they were turning away black people because the crow's nest was full, but there was all kinds of empty seats, down at ringside and in the first risers. And Ellis Auditorium probably seated 7,000-8,000 people. So conventional wisdom has it that this was all on Sputnik. But I think that Roy Welch, who was from right up the road in Dyersburg, and that's why he wanted Memphis. And that's another thing. Nick Gulas was from Birmingham. He went to Birmingham every Monday, and he was the boss down there. And he was telling the fans, yeah, go take your seats. We're about to get started. And he was running the show there very publicly. But Roy Welch, he was from Dyersburg up the road. He went to Memphis on Monday nights, and he was in the back, in the locker room, booking and manipulating and booking the cards. He never even wrestled on his own shows, even though he'd been a main event wrestler for 25 years at that point. I think that with some prodding and certainly at least Roy allowing him to, Sputnik went public in the newspapers and on TV and et cetera and said, I'm not going to wrestle here unless they let my black friends come and sit down where they can see me up close. And, naturally it got a lot of publicity and a lot of play, but they integrated, and you can even see the newspaper ads at the time in 1959, special seating sections for the colored fans. And they slowly integrated wrestling in Memphis that way and found out that they weren't going to have any riots and nobody got shot or killed or, whatever. And that gave way later on to all sporting events and then all public events sooner or later in Memphis being integrated. But then Sputnik really caught on, and the whole program with Billy Wicks caught on. And I did an article on this, and also part of it's in my book. But at the time, I think the first Sputnik Monroe and Billy Wicks match drew something like 4,000 or 5,000 people, and the newspaper said the largest wrestling crowd in Memphis in 4 or 5 years. And that lasted a couple weeks until they beat it. And then Sputnik wrestled the Bear, and he fought boxer Joey Maxim, and the houses kept going up. And finally, whereas early in the year, 5,000 people was like the biggest wrestling crowd in over 5 years in Memphis. They were doing outdoor ballpark shows with Sputnik and Billy Wicks on top. One of them drew 10,000 people, and then the big one drew 13,749. And another, depending on what newspaper you believe and what police estimate you believe, 3,000 or 4,000 people broke down the outfield fence and got in free when they wouldn't let them in. So they took the town from obscurity pretty much for the most of the 50s into drawing more people to see a wrestling match in Memphis than has actually paid to see one to this day, even with Lawler's huge run, because the Mid-South Coliseum only seated, a little less than 12,000.
And it's so interesting how many of these historical things happen in this territory because, of course, this integrated the fans where they were allowed to sit wherever they wanted and sit amongst each other. And then later on, several years later, Len Rossi and Bearcat Brown would team up, and I believe they were the first integrated tag team in the South. And obviously, Len Rossi being, if not the most popular, one of the very most popular wrestlers of that era, it got over, and it worked really well.
Well, and Len was also the booker for Nick on the Birmingham end. And he was hugely over in Birmingham and Chattanooga and Nashville, not so much in Memphis. People didn't really know him. He didn't spend a lot of time there. And he was in his car wreck pretty much right after Louisville and the rest of the Memphis end got opened up. But Len was the most popular babyface, and Bearcat Brown, Matt Jewell, was not only one of the more popular black wrestlers as a babyface, but also he was, and I don't want people to take this wrong, he was inoffensive. He was a good old Southern boy that talked humble on his interviews. It's not like it was, if it was Bearcat Wright and Len Rossi, it would not have worked. Bearcat Wright coming out in a dashiki and, quoting, Malcolm X or whatever, that would have not worked. But because it was Len Rossi and Bearcat Brown in the late 60s in Birmingham and Huntsville and Chattanooga and those places, there was no blowback. There was no protest. And then later on, as I mentioned, in the early 70s, when it was Sputnik and Norvell, they went for the heat because they were really the first integrated black and white heel team. And it worked because it wasn't really that new of a thing anymore, but they had to kind of slide it in gradually to get it by people. And Bearcat Brown was more over in that territory than, he worked Georgia and he worked Florida and he'd been other places in his career, but he'd never been past, really middle of the card that I'm aware of. But suddenly he's one of the top babyfaces in the territory. And when, obviously, when they did the angle where, the interns and Ken Ramey painted him white on Birmingham TV, they sold out like 6 weeks in a row to try to see Bearcat Brown get even. So they were able to, whereas if it had been 10 years before, I'm sure the fans would have been lining up to hand him a brush. But because of the way that it was presented, the white people got mad, as silly as this sounds now in this day and age, the white people got mad that the heels had painted the black guy white and wanted to see the black guy get even and beat the white guys up. That's how they were able to do that.
And it was extraordinary. And again, when you think of the civil rights movement, so much of it's based around Alabama. So the fact that this is happening in Alabama is extraordinary. And going back to Sputnik now, Jim, of course, he has this legendary run in 59 and 60, the feud with Billy Wicks. He would come back with Norvell Austin in the early 70s, come back as a manager in the late 70s, early 80s. But it seems that he's a little different than many of the other legends of Memphis wrestling. Fargo was always around. Lawler was always around. It seemed like Sputnik was maybe a notch below in his relationship with the office in that he wasn't always around. He was there and then he was gone.
He was, I think, Sputnik liked to take a drink in his time, from what I've been told. And also, to be honest, Sputnik worked a lot of other territories. You can go in the early 60s and the mid 60s and you can see Sputnik Monroe on top in Texas or in Florida or down in the old Mobile, Alabama territory or out in the Midwest. He went a lot of places. He, drank a lot. He drew a lot of money. He took a lot of bumps. He probably burned some bridges, but he was a pretty big star in wrestling and certainly well known within the industry for a long period of time. But it was quite a while before they brought him back to Memphis. But then again, even though he was a household name, there's no way you were ever going to top that first run. It still hasn't been topped, even by Jerry Lawler.
They're both passed away now, but when you watch the film Memphis Heat, there's considerable heat between Jackie Fargo and Sputnik Monroe.
Well, and that probably had quite a bit to do with, because Jackie was always going to be there, and Sputnik was the odd guy out in that.
One last thing, Jim. This year, Sputnik Monroe has been added to the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame ballot. Will he be getting your vote?
Are you... that Sputnik Monroe is not in any wrestling Hall of Fame of any description is a massive oversight already. So yeah, he'll get 3 or 4 of mine. Trump's people will be investigating me for voter fraud because I'll vote for him 5 times. He's got to be, just for the impact that he had just in that one place, but much less the fact he was one of the most colorful characters in the history of the business.